we're struggling as legacy organizations to understand that the only way to be successful is going to take things that are hard and brittle and fragile and make them soft and malleable and changeable. And in software, that's more approachable. It's not easy, right? It's difficult. It takes a long time, right? Expensive even. But with hardware, the fact that we have examples of people beginning to rethink the entire fundamental metaphor of manufacturing and the assembly line to really start to pull it into a more software-centric metaphor, I find very exciting. I think makes it a little bit more difficult in the hardware world is that there is so much existing infrastructure, physical infrastructure that has been built up over decades to do traditional manufacturing. And so the switching costs associated with hardware are much more difficult if you have investment in those. But if you were going to build hardware from the ground up and you didn't have that existing investment in legacy systems, then you would absolutely want to consider taking an open Agile Digital kind of approach to that. So there's this program, the word Agile Open Digital came from an Air Force spec. And the idea is that a missile needs to be able to be ideated, like built, conceived in 18 months. And in order to do that, what we need is like a componentized architecture. So when we talk about Agile, we're really talking about a componentized architecture. And you might say, well, in any given car, 70% of its components are off the shelf. In that sense, it's modular, but open is like slightly different. Open is like, I have a memory slot in my computer, and I can go get any memory card that meets this certain specification from any vendor, and I can plug it in, and it will work. Maybe slightly different from like how some of the Macs have been built over the years where you have to use a Mac part for it, right? And so modular is one thing, open is slightly different. If it has a common interface, a common performance spec, a common set of things it does, then that would be open. And in the missile systems metaphor, or really not a metaphor, in the missile systems example, I might want to have a propulsion system or a GPS sensor or a payload of that missile that operates like the memory chip does on the side of your computer. I could go to any one of the defense contractors, and as long as it meets that spec and has that common interface, then I could just plug it in, right? That creates a lot of resiliency in the supply chain of building a missile. The analog in software is very much like what we talk about when we talk about organizing around business capabilities. So a Scrum team, and this is idealized, it is very seldomly commonly practiced, at least at scale, is that we have an open organization. We have a modular organization. I know I'm kind of using those words a little bit differently or similarly, and they're different concepts, but they're in the same space. I want to organize around a business capability, a service within that software suite, maybe a feature set within that software suite. And ideally, I'd like to have a dedicated team that has total ownership over the technology, that has the ability to interface with the business, and then on every 2-week cycles, be able to produce a working testing increment of that software. But that component, that thing I'm going to form a team around, maybe a business capability or a feature, should be able to operate very similarly to like that memory chip example or the GPS sensor in a rocket. It has a size, it has a shape, it has a common interface, and I should be able to take that team out of my company. Maybe I can move it offshore. Maybe I could plug a different team in, right? So this idea of openness basically means that I have units organized around value that have a defined interface with the rest of the organization, a certain set of performance characteristics, and I can pull one out, plug another one in, right? So an open enterprise, there's a word that's going on right now that I actually like. I guess it's a Gartner phrase, I think, talks about composable enterprises. And a composable enterprise would theoretically be one that's built on like an open architecture. And it's like you're pulling in standardized Lego blocks and like kind of plugging the Lego blocks in. So when you talk about composability, we have a certain set of objects, a certain set of building blocks, and we can combine those objects in different ways to create different outcomes. Sometimes when you start to think about doing portfolio management, and you're thinking about bringing work into a queue, you can look across the objects that are in place and you can evaluate which of those objects are bottlenecks, which of those objects aren't performing the way that you would like them to, which objects need more capacity, really kind of all ways of saying the same thing, right? So, but the idea of openness is this idea of kind of like modularity on steroids, right? I like the metaphor. Actually, just like it's the first time I really thought of it that way. It's like, I'm sitting here looking at my Mac and it's got a USB-C port, and I can just plug other things in, and it understands how to work with them, right? So I think of that as like open. When I start talking about Agile, I mean that's kind of our home base, right? So Agile is the ability for that open object to receive real-time input, deliver incrementally and iteratively on some sort of regular cadence. So I think of agility is about the ability of that object to respond to change when it encounters new inputs, new information. Okay? And so going to like the Tesla example, I might have an open component like a battery. It plugs into the car through a standard interface. It has expected performance characteristics. It has expected inputs. It has expected outputs. What happens inside that component's external interface can iterate and change as much as we want. We can change the battery chemistry. We can change the software. We can theoretically make it have longer life. Whatever, as long as the external performance characteristics don't change. So when I think of agility, if I need to maybe have an external performance characteristics change or something, like I can change the inside of it, maybe without changing that external interface, something like that, right? And if I'm thinking of Agile across open components, right, now I'm thinking about how do I orchestrate the interactions of those components across those different service boundaries. So to kind of tie two concepts together, we talk about a lot. So if I think of openness, I'm really kind of thinking about the structure of the teams, the value structure of the organization. And I compose those value structures through Agile processes, right? Whether it be adaptation within the services boundaries, or whether it be the orchestration in small batches across multiple open components. So I might think of openness as the structure. I might think of agility as the governance framework. How do we manage change? How do we orchestrate the flow of value? How do we deal with batch size? Digital, I think the analog in our common terminology is really around, and this isn't going to be complete as an idea, as a concept, but I think it's really around metrics. Because one of the advantages of moving from, let's say, moving from manual systems to digital systems, or physical channels to digital channels, manual measurement to digital measurement, right? What we're really looking for is how to optimize the speed, performance, usability of the system. Then you can start to extend that into the idea of, like, in physical manufacturing, or I guess really even software, the idea of digital twins. So you take an open object that communicates with the system via some standardized interface using some predetermined governance, agile governance framework, and you wrap it in tests in such a way that you know whether it is behaving the way that you expect it to all the time. Maybe another way of thinking about it might be wrapped in tests. What's going on in my head is the idea of, like, digital twins, and where you could, it's a little bit like in the software world where you might create a feature toggle, or you stub out a portion of the code. You have a back-end system that isn't fully functional yet, so you might you might mock the service using some other piece of software, and then be able to feature toggle it and point it at you turn it on or off, or point it at one backend object or the other. So it allows the testing integrity of the system to continue to move forward in spite of that actual component being there. In a car, it might be like, well, we have everything else ready in the car, but we don't have the electric motors fully ready for the overall system. So what we do is we create a digital twin. We simulate that in software so that the rest of the car can be tested. Right? There's something in that space that I think is meaningful. And so if I were going to say Agile Open Digital, or maybe in this case I don't want to say Open Agile Digital, I might be thinking about openness as like the structure, agility as the governance framework, and metrics is like that digital ability to kind of like manage and measure and control and substitute, something like that, right? And I think this is really, really fascinating because there's a pattern that's going on in the industry right now. Dave and I talked about it on the podcast, where it's like it's about taking big things, monoliths, and breaking them down into services so that those services can be reused, scaled, tested in different ways. And what I think is fascinating is that historically we've had that problem with like legacy software systems. And since software is inherently softer than hardware, right, you have this notion of like legacy refactoring. And the metaphor that's starting to emerge in the hardware space is, how do we create that same malleability and get the same benefits that we have in the software world, but in a world that's hard? One of the anti-patterns that I see when people talk about using Agile for manufacturing, it's like again, there's just really interesting analogs. It's like there's a lot of organizations that will walk into and they're doing, in effect, waterfall. So they're doing all the analysis, all the build, all the design, all the tests, all the deploy. I don't see that often anymore in the market, but I was actually talking to a prospect the other day that literally had a traditional waterfall. I hadn't seen that in a minute. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to use Agile on top of the existing waterfall. So they would have analysis sprints, design sprints, build sprints, test sprints, deploy sprints. So they're using Scrum, they're using the practices of they're using practices of Scrum, but it's on top of a legacy structure and kind of governance framework. And in order to, but that defeats the purpose of Agile, because Agile isn't about using Scrum. Agile is about delivering incremental value earlier in the process. And so if you're just sprinting through analysis, design, build, test, deploy, you still don't have the ability to deliver and get feedback. And so what people do in the hardware world is that they take that same idea, because the car has not been reimagined as this digital device, an open system. What they're doing is they're using Agile to sprint through analysis, design, build, test, deploy. But the problem is it still takes me 3 years to get a new car. And by the way, if I learn something in that 3-year process, it's really difficult to change because the systems aren't open, the systems aren't digital, right? The systems aren't agile. And so you're using Scrum on top of a legacy manufacturing metaphor that isn't going to actually create the conditions that you want to have. So I think that's where this idea of open and agile go together. It's like if you have agile process, agile governance on top of a legacy monolith, whether it be in the software world or in the hardware world, all you're going to do is to get greater visibility into your late delivery and inability to change. So for Agile to really work, it needs to be applied to open systems. So, I've been talking about for years the idea that if you apply practice without changing the structure, if you apply Scrum without forming the right kinds of teams, then Scrum is going to fail. If you apply Agile at scale on top of a legacy monolith, at best you're going to get is sprint planning on top of waterfall delivery. And that is what we see all the time. So again, pulling this through, it's like what we would commonly say, like legacy refactoring of a software monolith into a more services-oriented architecture. I might say that as taking a more closed monolithic system and turning it into a more open system. I mean, these are not perfect metaphors, but that is like directionally correct. One of the comments that somebody put on one of my, I think it was the one where I was talking about a systems engineering approach to change management, and we need to engineer systems, and I was talking about the idea of software factories. And the person gave me a really long, thoughtful post. His name was Daniel. He gave me like a really long, thoughtful post, and then kind of apologized for being a little bit nitpicky. And what my response to him is that we're all learning how to talk about this stuff. And if we try to only talk about it once we fully understand it, we can't get other people thinking with us. And so kind of what I'm doing here with you guys is I'm thinking through these ideas out loud. And I think there's something here, right? And there's like a core principle, there's like a physics of it that is being made manifest. And it's interesting watching, we're struggling as legacy organizations to understand that the only way to be successful is going to take things that are hard and brittle and fragile and make them soft and malleable and changeable. And in software, that's more approachable. It's not easy, right? It's difficult. It takes a long time, right? Expensive even. But with hardware, the fact that we have examples of people beginning to rethink the entire fundamental metaphor of manufacturing and the assembly line to really start to pull it into a more software-centric metaphor, I find very exciting. I've had the opportunity to speak to several hardware manufacturers about this idea, and the idea is compelling. What I think makes it a little bit more difficult in the hardware world is that there is so much existing infrastructure, physical infrastructure that has been built up over decades to do traditional manufacturing. And so the switching costs associated with hardware are much more difficult if you have investment in those. But if you were going to build hardware from the ground up and you didn't have that existing investment in legacy systems, then you would absolutely want to consider taking an open agile digital kind of approach to that. So what's interesting is this convergence between hardware and software. Maybe convergence is the wrong word, right? But this, the lessons learned in legacy refactoring and in building new scalable systems, the things we've learned over the last 20 years, the hardware people are starting to see ways of doing that as well. And I was actually exploring this with a couple of my team members earlier in the week, the idea that open agile digital applies everywhere in an organization. And so it's not just open agile digital hardware, it's not just open agile digital software, it's open agile digital organizational design, it's open agile digital business process. And then when I got that Gartner article around, and I think it was a Gartner article around the idea of a composable enterprise, it really made a ton of sense, right? It's like people, tools, and technology organized around these open objects, wrapped in tests, right? Being components of a composable enterprise. And at times those entities are building software products. Sometimes they're building hardware products. Sometimes they're legacy systems or manual systems that we're moving to a more digital world. So a lot of what's really going on is as Agile marginalizes itself industry-wide, and make no mistake, Agilists are in the process of marginalizing themselves. Agile is like a process that teams do. Agile is being reduced to Scrum and the practices of Scrum. And where people are trying to explore these more rich systems engineering type metaphors is through words like digital transformation, business transformation, to a lesser degree like scaled agile, this Air Force spec of Agile Open Digital, the work that Tesla and SpaceX are doing that I've learned about through Joe Justice's work, which I think is really cool. So there's this, I think what we're uncovering is that this open agile digital model it's becoming like a fundamental principle. And I think it's a better way of saying teams, backlogs, working tested software. Because that's what I've been hunting at with this teams, backlogs, working tested software thing. And the reason I went down the path of teams, backlogs, working tested software is because I was trying to get people to see that agile practices don't matter. It's not about those practices. It's about the business benefit that they create. So the team is like that open, pluggable module. The backlog is, it's going to be kind of weird language, but the backlog's like the agile process governance kind of a thing. The working tested software is really about the standard measurable outputs. I think there's something in that. There's a parallelism that's starting to emerge. And again, like what's cool is when you start to see these ideas made manifest in software. We've been wrestling with this in software for a long time. What Leading Agile's been trying to do is to really overlay the software and the organizational design. I've been doing so many recordings and writings and stuff. I start to forget where I've talked about these things. But one of the things I was exploring over the last week or so was this idea of domain-driven design. And we are having a fairly rich conversation inside the company because the language that we use when we're in the early stages of a transformation and we're hunting team formation strategies, what we typically do is like take a business capability model, what we'd describe as a business architecture, and we'd look for the technology architecture, we'd look at the organizational design, we look at the product architecture. And what we're hunting for are encapsulated objects that are relatively dependency-free, or we desire them to be dependency-free. What we're really saying is that I want a open, pluggable component, and then that starts to marry into the idea of this openness. It starts to marry into this idea of the composable enterprise, right? So it's like we have composable enterprises made up of agile teams, agile open teams, right? And then what I think is fascinating is when you take the idea of like digital. I was having a conversation with a financial advisor, not like a personal financial advisor, but like somebody who's like a business financial advisor. And we were talking about, how would you make a case for onshore or offshore, or what could be replaced with AI? And this idea, if I had this composable object that was like this intersection of business capability, technology, people, product, right? And that composable object was like the product. It was exposed via defined interface with the right tests and performance characteristics. Like theoretically, you could take an onshore team and move it offshore. Like one of the big challenges we're having in industry right now is that so many of the CFOs are just thinking about the unit cost of the individual. So somebody in the US is $150 an hour, maybe somebody offshore is $15 an hour or something. And we're only doing that based upon the cost of the people. But what if I could take and prove I have this composable object, and so I take my offshore team and I wrap it as this composable object with tests, and then I say, okay, well, I have 10 people offshore. I'm going to have 3 people onshore that cost twice as much as those 10 people offshore. So I have 3 people instead of 10. The cost is doubled. But what if I could measure that the actual value density, the actual throughput actually was going to create a 10x return on that 2x investment with, 2x investment with a third the people or something, right? There's something in that I think is super interesting. And so that's kind of where like my brain is right now. And so that's kind of what we're exploring. So like the relationship between teams, backlogs, working tested software, structure, governance, and metrics, Agile Open Digital, this notional idea of like a composable organization, right? It all starts to kind of fit together because, at the end of the day, and this is why the Agile community is going to get so left behind if we don't wrap our head around this idea, is that it isn't about Scrum. At the team sense or at the department sense, it's about being able to put things in market and get feedback, but that's even only part of it. It's using these concepts to manage like through the macroeconomic conditions in the company and attaching those things like business strategy and be able to deploy investments. And so it's cool, right? It's like when you start to see something that you've been wallowing in for 20 years and you start to see how broadly generally applicable it is, it's really a cool thing to start to explore. And so, yeah. So what I'm just going to do, what I'm kind of committed to doing is just talking about it. I'm in this place where like a lot of people are kind of coming into my world and like everybody's like dropping clues, and it's really interesting. And what I've found is that the more I talk about these things, the more people go yes and or no but, and it creates kind of a rich dialogue. So I guess what I'm saying is I'd really just appreciate if anybody has any thoughts on this, like what you're thinking about.